Ladies and gentlemen, could you take your seats, please? Could you take your seats? We've allowed a little extra time to allow latecomers to arrive, and I'm sure latecomers will continue to come in, but I thought we should get going. I'm Deborah Swallow, I'm the director of the Courtauld, and it's a huge pleasure to me to welcome you all here tonight to our Vernon Square campus. Got a very exciting program, and my function really just is to make that welcome to you. And just to say a few words of thanks for all the people who have made this evening possible. And this evening has been actually quite long in the planning. I think it was evolved and envisaged at least a year ago, so we're thrilled that it's come to pass. And I just wanted to thank those who made it happen. So first of all, Faiza Lalji, the director of the Aga Khan's Patrons Committee and the Aga Khan Museum, who have given support and are co-hosting with us all for this programme. I'd like to thank the Pilar Corias Gallery and especially Charlotte Brooks. And of course, the main thanks go to Shazia Sikandar herself and to her interlocutor, Sadia Abbas. I have apologies from our colleague Faisal Devji of the University of Oxford, who was going to be with us and sadly cannot be this evening, and he sends his apologies to you all. But on that note, I want to invite Zara. Faiza I'm getting my order wrong. Faiza to open up the event, and we'll hand over to her. So, warm welcome, Faiza.
I just want to say a quick hello, really. There's obviously a very kind of interesting evening and program ahead, and you want to hear from Shazia herself and all the people that have something to say about her work. But my name is Faiza, as Deborah mentioned, and I chair the work of the Aga Khan Museum here in the UK. And we just last week sort of celebrated our 3-year anniversary of creating programs here, exhibitions and talks in collaboration with other institutions. Obviously, we're based in Toronto. We've now been open for about 5 years this September, but there is a kind of audience here and a critical mass of people interested in the content and culture of the Muslim world. So we're very proud to partner with the Courtauld this evening, and we now have a kind of built a network of more than 60 partners in the UK and delivered more than 50 programs over the last 3 years. And this isn't really kind of the first time that we've done something with the Courtauld. Zara and Deborah have both hosted programs with us previously, and Susan Babai just did something for us last week at Aga Khan Center, where she spoke about the ribbon of Islamic gardens at the center. So we're pleased to be coming back. The director of the museum, Dr. Henry Kim, was here last year in conversation with Dr. Swallow, and we've collaborated and thought through a number of things with Zara in the context of the contemporary and modern South Asian art series and kind of Asian art at the Courtauld. And really our purpose is to kind of not connect ourselves to a particular geography or time period, but try and cover historic, modern, contemporary, the Middle East, South Asia, Europe, North America, and show a diverse kind of collection of practices and histories that are connected to this world. And really this year in particular, we focused on living artists and their contribution and their role in contemporary Muslim civilizations and cultures. And so Shazia is our kind of second to last event of the year. And we're really thrilled. Shazia has also done collaborations with the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. In 2017, she was part of Nuit Blanche, which is a large festival in Toronto. And in 2018, she exhibited as part of Listening to Art, Seeing Music. And that piece was called Disruption as Rapture, and really featured animated miniature illustrations from the 18th century manuscript of Gulshan-i-Ishq, Rose Garden of Love. So we're really delighted to be here again this evening. Thank you very much for having us. And we very much hope that this kind of contributes to our mission of fostering greater kind of understanding and appreciation for the culture of this this part of the world. So thank you all for having us and for coming this evening.
Hi, so just very quickly to introduce someone who needs no introduction, which is Shazia Sikandar herself, who will shortly be coming to speak to us about her work and her projects. So Shazia's pioneering practice takes Indo-Persian miniature painting at its point of departure and challenges the strict formal tropes of the genre by experimenting with scale and various forms of new media. Informed by South Asian, American, feminist, and Muslim perspectives, Shazia has developed a unique and critically charged approach to this time-honored medium, employing its continuous capacity for reinvention to interrogate ideas of language, trade, empire, and migration. So she was trained as a miniaturist at the National College of Arts in Lahore, and she will talk to us a little bit about the beginnings of her practice and also how she has sort of expanded this tiny format and made it massive in a way. And so I now invite Shazia to come and talk to us.
Good evening, everybody. Give us a minute. So I would like to thank everyone that is present here for taking out their time to come here to listen to my presentation and, of course, to the panel afterwards. But especially, I'd like to thank the students, because I know that students are always juggling a lot of deadlines and work. So I'm going to spend like 10-15 minutes giving a very broad presentation of my practice, and then I will show you some clips from a documentary about 2 permanent public artworks at Princeton University, and then sort of move through select bodies of work, switching back and forth from still images to animations. Unfortunately, I can't share 30 years of a full arc of practice, so I would encourage you guys that notice if there's some images that you really want me to elaborate, you can always ask when we have the Q&A. So there's going to be quite a lot of images to go through, and I'm not sure if the order of talking about them and specific images is going to fall exactly in place. But being an artist, I think the visual language is my strength, and I definitely want to show you quite a range of different images that are here. But I think of myself as a thinker. So a thinker that explores ideas through drawing, literary histories, poetry, ghazal, rap, fiction, opera, all are magical places of departure for me. I conceive of my paintings as poems. Such an interface with text has been hand in hand with my growth as a visual artist as well as an individual. Storytelling remains a mysterious process of discovery, a sort of a pendulum between text and image. I engage with creativity as a means to think outside of the proverbial box, striving to make work that can exist in multiple contexts and that can undergo various geographical, cultural, gendered, psychological transformations. For almost 3 decades, I have examined the art historical tradition of Indo-Persian miniature painting, seeing my role as primarily investigative, pursuing the provenance and story of Islamic visual traditions. So this goal in uncovering artistic histories has often been inspired to create and invent forms that challenge patriarchal structures, that challenge sort of colonial art history narratives. And in drawing unexpected connections and juxtapositions, I can move stories and people forward. I work across media and forms, including digital animation, video, performance, large-scale murals, installations, projections, works on paper. Through my creative process, I have been able to cultivate a creative space for Indo-Persian miniature painting, a genre that often was considered too rigid for contemporary artistic expression. So I was born in Lahore in 1969. I know I'm old. I was just talking to these two young artists here that and it came up. So, which of course then brings to always I have to kind of introduce everybody that one grew up during the Zia-ul Haq's military dictatorship. So obviously it's very different climate now, but this is in the 80s, and at that time, I felt that, of course, as my generation and peers, that it was robbing the youth of its innate need to express. So as a young teenager, I felt increasingly stifled and gravitated towards humanities in search of a creative environment to reflect upon the mechanisms of power and the potential for individual freedom. One of my very first mentors as a student, actually in high school at the Convent of Jesus and Mary, was the late artist Lala Rukh, who gave me my first job to design posters and brochures. There was a campaign on rape and creating the letterhead for her Seymour Foundation. Being a part of WAF, like the Women Action Forum that Lala was one of the founding members, gave me substantial insight into women's rights and issues, as well as the broader grasp on the intersections of community and art. I was also inspired by women leaders like Asma Jahangir, the human rights activist, who was also my father's cousin, again, at the time when I was at the convent. And I grew up in a family of storytellers. No immediate member was a professional author, but everyone enjoyed sharing oral traditions and histories. My first memory is of my father reading to me Korny Tchaikovsky's book, Unusual Tales, translated into Urdu. So this sort of creative freedom that, even as a child, remembering my father and customizing the tales as he read out loud was infectious and entertaining. That's him. It signaled to me as a young child to be inventive. A couple of years later, encounters with Edgar Allan Poe, Lewis Carroll, Walter de la Mare, alongside stories of Miraj, the visionary night journey of Prophet Muhammad, felt like Everest expedition in pursuit of wit, candor, irony. So in high school, the pendulum swung between Shakespeare and Salman Rushdie, and then multitude of sources in between, allowing my imagination to inspect reality from different cultural consequences. The Soviet-Afghan War, Soviet-Afghan-US-Pak War, 1978 to 92 at that time, was not yet making international headlines, but the people in the region were experiencing the social, political, and cultural ruptures of that war directly. So this is the time in Pakistan of incessant institutionalization of religion by the authorities and international warmongering, which was a deeply conflicting experience. The emergence of Hudud Ordinance, which limited women's rights as a result of the war, also loomed large. This was counter to the personal experience one grew up with regarding belief, spirituality, the intrinsic mix of secular, spiritual, and religious Muslimness that I experienced in my immediate family and community. So this sort of diminishing of women's rights, emerging blasphemy laws, Islamization project, the polarized public-private spaces discouraged dissent and creative expression. In my experience of high school, switching back and forth from English to Urdu instruction at the whim of the government was also what later seemed like a failed cultural reform experiment. Although an education in English medium Catholic school was seen as advantageous, its predominantly English curriculum and rote learning I had to consciously dismantle later as an artist. Textbooks did not reflect our realities. The 1980s in Lahore was a confusing time. So as a young adult, I was confident to explore miniature painting when it was not popular in Pakistan in the late 80s and generated much attention for it through my work. So what is miniature painting? Book art, Islamic, Indo-Persian, an idiom of visual language reduced to tradition, relegated in general to the low art category and outsider to the Western canon. That is how I encountered it in the mid-80s, and I was keen to disrupt its burdened representation. This is me recently visiting Bashir Ahmed, who was teaching miniature painting for a long time, and he was my teacher in 1986, 87 also. I will talk about the project I worked there, the scroll. I will also get a chance to talk about it with Sadia. So miniature painting to me at that time, was also something that was mired in complicated history, an unpopular subject, since its prevalent iterations of tourist kitsch were more visible than, say, perhaps its indigenous status. So also the significance of local artists was overshadowed by the art history curriculum itself. I often wondered about the logic of reading Art Through the Ages as a student in Pakistan that did not include South Asian artists. There were no special courses at the time to discuss the history of Pakistani art either. And in terms of miniature painting, its pre-colonial history was written mostly by Westerners from the perspective of Eurocentric 19th century scholarship. Miniature painting, with its unresolved national status and deep stigma, captured the paradox of culture and nationalism far more than any other discipline at NCA in the shifting geopolitical landscape of the 1980s. How tradition is defined and how it is disseminated, that performative aspect captured my imagination as a student, both in Pakistan and later at the Rhode Island School of Design. Miniatures are often hiding out of sight in Western museum storages or in private collections yet to be published. And, so for me, it's always been interesting to highlight the politics of provenance, ownership, narration. By taking a closer look at historical works, documents, unarchived materials to use as inspirations for new directions, the journey to explore the personal had already started in Pakistan in my work. So, I joined NCA in 1997. I do my thesis work in 1989, finish it in 90. There was a strike. The school was closed for 6 months. I graduated in 91. I started teaching at NCA in 1992. In 93, I started my master's at the Rhode Island School of Design. So this journey to explore the personal had already started in Pakistan in my work. With distance from home, the process of self-actualization came into focus. The new work started to resist the straitjacketing that I encountered in terms of one's biography. Who I was and what I represented became limiting constructs as the burden projected onto me to represent a culture felt not just unfair but alien. Becoming the other, the outsider, through the polarizing paradigm of East-West led to an outburst of iconography, of fragmented and severed bodies, androgynous forms, armless, headless torsos, self-rooted, floating, half-human figures reminiscent of female and children's bodies. Explicit, dislocated, buoyant, experimental in scale, ephemeral in nature, the work started to expand in format and medium as I started to paint on floors, walls, and develop performance as a means to collaborate with others. Learning how to drop fear and embrace vulnerability to live the true potential of the mind with burning questions was exhilarating and painful. The search to create work that demanded internalizing also meant dealing with the frustration to unlearn. It was never as simple as creating new narratives in just the miniature style. The Euro-American canon dominating the field of dominating the field of painting and art history was still very much Eurocentric in the early 90s. Even though the big theme emerging after the fall of the Berlin Wall and economic transformation was globalization, contemporary art from South Asia was still not visible in exhibitions or in gallery representations. I'm talking about 1995 to late 90s. Reading art journals, art history books that did not relate or represent one's experience, one had to use imagination a lot. This is in graduate school in 1993 to 95. My work started to breach national boundaries to dismantle control over women's bodies in visual and national representations. Ismat Chughtai, Kishwar Nahid started conversing with Fatima Mernissi, Bell Hooks, Helen Sissou, as I started to manipulate the established forms and pictorial conventions of miniature paintings further. Decolonizing also meant locating context and intimacy across race and sexuality. By dislocating traditional framing devices of center and margin within miniature painting, I could open up the narratives of gender and sexuality. So I was understanding how to identify and deconstruct various assumptions, whether you call them stereotypes, but to open up a dialogue. How could one's work contribute to that kind of collapse of authority? What was my role as an artist, and how I could contribute towards a new cultural code of acceptance and rejection? So this sort of journey has been about creating also an emotional, not only an intellectual dialogue with miniature. Well, I'm going to also share with you a public art project which was commissioned by Princeton University. It was actually a project that I won. It was a national call. So here, it provides this sort of opportunity to really work at a permanent level and at a very large scale provided me with a wonderful challenge to bring to life ideas in a new material. And I developed a partnership with Franz Mayer of Munich to experiment with the material of glass. And glass was sort of a natural direction, as much of my work deals with transparency and layering. Glass was also offering a permanent and malleable materiality for the visual lexicon. Scale per se was not of concern that much, since, as I shared in images, that I had worked on numerous large-scale, over 150-foot immersive installations and murals, etc., in the past. So I think more for me, what was more interesting was how I could use the International Building as well as the Economics Department building to show a sense of storytelling through the images of flight, descent, and material economies to invite contemplation and conversation. At this point, I think I'm going to share, if you bear with me, a little bit of the film. I'm going to skip through it because it's a 12-minute piece. And I just wanted to show you guys that you can see the scale and also maybe a little bit of the process in my studio.
Hint at a narrative that continues beyond. So even if one looked at the folios of the Princeton University Library's late 16th century manuscript that also inspired this work, you will notice that there's an aspect of infinity in those drawings. That idea has always been at the core of my dismantling traditional miniature paintings. I started to think of the iconography that is within my work and how certain elements have a very strong relationship to history, and how some of the trenchant historical symbols I have been invested in resurrecting them and altering their meaning and shifting their context to see what type of potential there lies within them, that they can be, that they can open up new avenues of meaning and interpretation. Animation was a natural outcome of my interest in storytelling. Like recent animations have expanded to multi-channel immersive works. Animation like The Last Post and Parallax explore colonial legacy of trade, as well as like the circulation of objects and ideas. Parallax was shown in multiple places in 2016, and I was thinking also in terms of a square-like space for Princeton. So suddenly there's this epiphany that what if I took the cinematic space and turned it upside down?
But maybe these dark lines?
I wanted to be involved and not just send an image for a paint-by-number reproduction.
This can be a little bit less.
The sensitivity with which the material of glass is transformed is intrinsic to the final experience of the work. A particular image of the feminine form with no head and it's self-rooted has so much resonance. That image still signifies the expunging of the feminine from histories, from religions, from cultures, from our political discourse.
So there were two projects. I'll move on to the next one. The next one was painted on glass, and these are some of the
Imagination and lack of imagination. Contemplative fact plays with the stuplet notation in music. painting of density and layering, packing and unpacking. There are 5 ideas or modes compressed in this work. There is reference to American capitalism through my painting, The Big Ritz. Then there's the spiritual dimension, portrait of Stasis, portrait of Adam Smith, and an outline of one of the historic Mirage paintings. There is history and then there is storytelling happening in both the works, especially in ideas around redaction. Then there's the perception of authority, there's power hierarchies, independence. What is freedom? What is freedom, especially within the economic global patterns that link all humans? Creativity has no national, racial, or religious boundaries. It is the power of imagination that fosters new discourse and creates new frontiers. With imagination comes humility and inventiveness.
So this, just to mention the use of Adam Smith in the economics building, I thought that playing on that figure, the philosopher, the author of The Wealth of Nations, who argued against monopolies using the demise of the East India Company as a case study, would be a very witty way, because he's trapped in the company attire and he's fashioned in the company school of miniature painting that emerged in India under the colonial rule. His lofty ideas have grown wings, but he is entrapped in luminous glass, unable to fly. So this kind of notion that we are still caught in the same old patterns of inequities of wealth. As I did this project, it shifted a move into the direction of mosaic. But when I was creating mosaics, I was really reminded of my journey to this very ancient medium was coming through the dynamism of the pixel. So there's this immediate relationship of the pixel becoming the unit of the mosaic. And born from there, one is able to develop new works in this new material. And I have done several projects. I'm working on new site-specific public artwork for the city of Houston. Also, I think related to the idea of Adam Smith, some of the earlier works, The Last Post, which was very interesting for me to yesterday see some of the paintings that one visited and saw the actual Badshah-Nama at the Windsor, and some of the works that I had done with The Last Post used some of those paintings. So to see the actual was really another understanding of the detail and depth that lies within some of this work, and so much of it is not necessarily visible, not just in catalogs, etc., but also in the sense of invisibility that lies when so much of the work is unarchived and not necessarily accessible to a lot of people. So this interest is really at the core of creating iconographies that can move across different languages and that can reemerge. And continuously in their reemergence, they keep pushing meaning forward. So I think I'm going to move into portraiture, because some of the I was thinking that, in these past 2 years, we have seen strong women's voices taking a stance towards misogyny, misrepresentation, oppression. And in that spirit of empowerment, like many others, I have been deeply inspired also by women that I work work with, whether it's my collaborator of 10 years, Duyan, and other writers and authors like Sadia Abbas, who's here. And also in terms of iconography that deals so much with the female form, like where all of that sort of gels together. You may see also I've done portraiture here. I am working, this is the project that I'm working, which deals with the feminine in nature, and it's going to convert into a fountain and will be installed in Houston within, like, I think this year. And it's also based on my interpretation of Mary Magdalene. So it's a piece that I did, which again, it's called Mary Am. It deals with the multiplicity of various Marys. Here you can see some of the images that'll allow, like, the work to be placed on this sculptural space. I have been working with poets. This particular image is my portrait of Adrienne Rich, and many avatars from her work. I also, like many others in the US and around the world, have been inspired by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's campaign and how a young demographic of women is opening the political discourse towards a more participatory space for non-white people. Many of them happen to be women of color: Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Lauren Underwood, Sharis Davids, Ayanna Pressley, all of these interesting, wonderful, energized people. And I think as a Pakistani American, an Asian American, a Pakistani Muslim American, where there's so many different categories that one is subjected to in America, I'm interested to question also that what it means to be an American at this moment. And so a lot of my engagement with portraiture comes from that space. It often takes individuals and scholars and authors and writers that have influenced me. So Fanon and is here. This is these are portraits that I did. Fatima Mernissi, Fahmida Riaz. So art, this notion of color, has often been associated in terms of, like, how sculpture, portraiture, the sculptural portraiture, like how we see that as, being the history of Greek classical Western sculpture as being without color. But this notion of color was often associated with a certain barbarism, the uncivilized, the other, indicating the cultural values of Eurocentrism and minority visual aesthetic, often first seen from its ability to be political or culturally specific than its formal dimensions and artistic production. So unfortunately, such entrenched positions still persist in media and the construction of popular culture, and point at how the history of ancient art still seeps into our contemporary understanding of race and culture. Art has been a deeply personal vehicle for me to engage paradoxes of such nature, the polarities, and often through female accounts and narratives. Iconographies present in my work have been a direct result to counter narrow definitions of the other and provide a broader representation of the female agency when possible. So I painted the scroll when I was actually 19. So to be transported back in time this much it's wonderful, but not in any nostalgic way. I bring it up also because Sadia and myself have been in this wonderful conversation that's for Alif magazine, Alif publication in Lahore, Pakistan, that's going to address how her book, her fiction, first fiction, The Empty Room, and The Scroll have incredible parallels. So the scroll came about by reflecting on the interiority of space, internal, physical, how to depict it in the miniature language, how to condense space and capture detail but not be defined by limitations of time. One of the visual references that I studied deeply was the Safavid painting's use of storytelling by activating the boundaries of the house. The fact that I chose to focus on a house was also because that era was defined by the looming Hudud ordinances, and as a young single woman, one could not freely roam around the city. So it made sense to me to locate the work in the house where I was bound to be spending majority of my time. The scroll, interestingly, is also about creating kinship with an inspiring mentor, the architect Nayyar Ali Dada. So the protagonist in this painting is struggling in the space. It is painted transparent, often as if it's moving through space, always restless, diaphanous, passing through time, and not being rooted in the moment that the other characters exist in. The figures of a young girl who is in transition, in the process of determining who she is. She's everywhere. She's the observer, but you never see her face. Her face is never visible. So when I was reading Saadia's book, the main character, Thaira, became familiar to me because she's caught in similar conflicting ways within the confines of her house, but in her case, it's her in-laws' house. So while painting the scroll, it was not for me that important whose house it was. What I wanted to depict was the transitory nature of life, where the house is just one abode. Again, a very spiritual notion borrowed from the historical Safavid. So in Empty Room, Thaira is looking at Zubaida Agha's self-portrait. And Zubaida Agha is, again, another fantastic icon whose portraits I'm making right now. And the woman painting the self-portrait in the scroll is neither, she's very much also about the representation of women, where you are depicting past, present, future, all in one place. And when I thought of this moment, I think that women like my generation, Saadia and myself, we were struggling to create a rupture from the present towards the future, moving away from the prevalent layers of patriarchy in the late 80s. And I think in that sense, we are both formed of that moment, and also having, living in the US, what it means for us now as Pakistani American women. Now I want to quickly talk a little bit about the Parallax film and show a little bit of the animation there too. And working in film also came about in response to confinement. The 15-minute film was fed from hundreds of drawings made alongside elaborate editing and collaboration with animators, composers, poets. It was challenging in its own way, forcing me to step outside the familiar confines of painting to imagine a kinetic and interdisciplinary work. So my work, of course, embraces uncertainty and flux. I'm not looking to synthesize, but to elaborate and define difference. Art allows me to dig into the unknown and to be challenged by the mysteries of the world, both real and imagined. In many of these, in Parallax, oil is oozing out of all the perceived orifices, cracks in the gouache, the armature of the animation, equating ink with oil, then oil with movement, movement with time, time with history, and history with hierarchy. I was linking material with matter, drawing with thinking, and power with natural resources. Oil signifies the rupture. Once unleashed, it is impervious, seeping in all facets of the animation. So recently I've been reading The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh. where he talks, the altered political reality may in part be an effect of the dominance of petroleum in the world economy. The flow of oil is radically unlike the movement of coal. The nature of coal as a material is such that its transportation creates multiple choke points where organized labor can exert pressure on corporations and the state. This is not the case with oil, which flows through pipelines that can bypass concentrations of labor. This is exactly why British and American political elites began to encourage the use of oil over coal after the First World War. These effects succeeded perhaps beyond their own wildest dreams. As an instrument of disempowerment, oil has been spectacularly effective in removing the layers of power from the reach of the populace. No matter how many people take to the streets in massive marches, they cannot put their hands on the real flows of power because they do not help to produce it. They only consume. So, oil plays a big role, but the nature of this liquid in Parallax is also made from hair, women's hair. So this is kind of constant play with a variety of motifs that actually intersect in very political ways. So when I saw this photograph of the oil rig, which was Julian Rush's photograph, I'm going to go back to it. I didn't know at that time that oil rigs were called Christmas trees. So I read it and I equated the title and its context to the ingenious English wit, a comment on the gift-bearing sentiment of the oil rigs, and thus created Christmas trees out of the valves, spools, and knobs using chains as garlands. So this image then became, a pivotal image for the animation itself, but then further on as a symbol of extraction. And I have been working on a series of these ideas around extraction, what it means to extract versus what is the counter narrative to this notion of extraction. So Parallax embodies power and conflict, but fundamentally omission and loss, and the distance between the real and the imagined. So this particular work was realized also through not just the ink drawings, but very much through my time in a defunct cinema space that I visited while I was researching for the Sharjah Art Biennial. And so this building, reminded me of a lot of architecture in Karachi, the cinemas there. And exactly when I actually went there and met with the guy who opened the building for me was the laborer who had come to build the cinema, and he was the caretaker, but he had actually come in 1976 to physically build it, and his visa was still linked and attached to the architecture. So as the caretaker is the sole survivor, and he becomes the protagonist in Parallax. So the building's toxicity, its lack of hospitality, was in sharp contrast to the layers of its history visible under the rubble and years of dirt, pigeon droppings. There were posters of familiar Indian Bollywood films, everything very ghost-like, a theatrical presence. So the whole thing that I then, I created was like almost as if the last picture show for him. And as I thought of time, of life, of tenacity, resistance, and imagined a multi-channel piece that could become cinematic, it was also about the idea of landscape and cartography, both human movements in time. And it made me think very much of Mahmoud Darwish's I Have a Seat in the Abandoned Theater, whose evocative imagery of despair and interconnected fate was deeply resonant. The score was created by Diyan, coming to Diyan, who has been a fantastic collaborator of mine for more than a decade. I met her at a residency at the Rockefeller Foundation, Bellagio, in 2009. And then later, I invited her to collaborate with me for a piece I did for the Rockbund Art Museum. And that was The Last Pose. So it made sense to me to engage Diyan because she had grown up in Shanghai and was a New York transplant like myself. So we have worked on all of my projects, and we are working currently on 2 new projects also. What strikes me as a fundamental enabler of our collaboration is our mutual investment in a multivalent, multidimensional form and state of experience. Her interest in the polyrhythmic, or maybe the polytextural, is very much about building sound density in ways that parallel my employment of layers of color and varying opacities to craft depth in the visual compositions. So then I introduced Diyan to Pakistani musician and novelist Ali Sethi. And that was fantastic because it led to a beautiful collaboration of theirs and mine, and which is the score of the piece that was playing in Pakistan, Disruption as Rapture, which has played in many, many places. It also played at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. And for its iteration in Lahore, for the Lahore Art Biennial, we also engage with the children from the walled city. And I think this kind of capacity in how we can keep our autonomies alive in the work while creating like a kind of a collaborative space for everybody to coexist allows almost for me that type of space is about indeterminacy and improvisation, which I think stems from my interest in the Sabri brothers, in the genre of Qawwali, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. I also, as a young adult, grew up loving the Bollywood epics and the romantic approach to music. But I was equally engaged with composers like not just R.D. Burman but Xenakis, Thelonious Monk. And all of this speaks to Diyan too, and I think in that respect, time becomes a language that we both collaborate. Time is important to the idea of the distance between two aspects. And this notion of the lacuna, where missing chunks in tradition or history allow ruptures to occur, basically allows us as artists to insert ourselves within tradition. She invariably performs live when the animations are shown, often with other musicians, and feels free to change the score. I'm very much open to such approaches, and I think this type of collaborative space with the composers, musicians, authors, poets is really integral to how I think and work. I will share just a few. I'm not sure how good we are on time, but if you would like, I can end here.
Yeah, but do show us a little bit.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll show the Disruption as Rapture.
दोस्तों, अंधेरी राय जीरा मोरा लर्जे आपके चैन लगाए
All right, I will end here.
Hi, so we're now going to have a little conversation, and maybe the light can come on. Thank you. So joining us is Sadia Abbas, who's been referred to several times. And Sadia, can you come up and sit at the table? So Sadia Abbas is an associate professor of postcolonial studies at Rutgers University, where she also directs the multimedia and multidisciplinary series Postcolonial Questions and Performances. She specializes in postcolonial literature and theory, the culture and politics of Islam and modernity, early modern English literature, and the history of 20th century criticism. She's the author of At Freedom's Limit, Islam and the Postcolonial Predicament, winner of the MLA First Book Award, and the novel The Empty Room, longlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. And it tells the story of a woman painter in 70s Pakistan. She has written numerous essays on subjects including Jesuit poetics and Catholic martyrdom in early modern English poetry, neoliberalism, and the Greek debt crisis, as well as Pakistani art. She's currently completing a volume on Shazia's work, which she's co-editing, and this is the major catalogue for the RISD retrospective, which she's co-editing with Jan Howard of the RISD Museum, and is in a series of collaborations with Shazia that include a conversation regarding the affinities between their work in the Alif magazine. And what's really even more exciting is that for this, she's sort of her next novel that she's researching is about the repression of colonial history by the British, something that I think we all feel a lot about, especially me. And so, so I'm going to invite Sadia up there, and if we can sort of begin a little conversation, and if Sadia can start with telling us about both of your project and how you've gone off to Lahore and the sort of miniature painting department in Bashir Ahmad a little bit, and give us some context.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you especially again to the students. Thank you also to the Pilar Corias Gallery for enabling the trip, and to Charlotte, who was right there, for being extraordinarily patient with my very confusing demands, because I've been hiding in a Greek village for the past 6 weeks, and I must say, in characteristically cranky fashion, that only Shazia could have drawn me out of it. So, but when she told me that I should come to London, I obeyed, as I always do. In any case, thank you very much, Charlotte. Thank you, Zara, for the invitation, and thank you, Shazia, for asking me to be here. There's not very much to say after that, but I'll try. So what we are doing, and what, again, Shazia demanded that I do with Jan Howard, who's fantastic, the curator, one of the curators at the RISD Museum, is co-edit a book. And it's not just a catalogue, but it's actually, we're hoping that it'll be a major scholarly intervention about Shazia's work, and it's going to accompany the RISD exhibition about the early work, which is then going to travel to the Morgan Museum in New York. I believe they have signed now the contract, and I'm not sure yet, but I think it's also Houston. Shazia has the details. I'm just the scribe. But in any case, so one of the things, and I was asked to conceptualize the book with Jan. One of my suggestions was, because there's so much information, shall we call it politely, out there about Shazia's early years, was that we actually go to Pakistan and sit down with Bashir Ahmad, the teacher of miniature painting at NCA, the National College of Arts, and go through some of his records. He's an extraordinary man, and is himself an archive. He also is a delightful hoarder of just about every paper that's ever crossed his desk or floor, because of course he works on the floor, and will not relinquish it, just so you know. So we had to make copies, but he's got everything. He's got Shazia's first, I'm sorry, I can't swear, but first, I don't know, sort of first drawing. He's got Imran Qureshi's grades. He's got all. I mean, it's hilarious. And he wants to talk about them all with you, but you have to sit there with him. So we sat with him for, I think, 3 days, 2 days. I don't know what it was. It's extraordinary. In any case, so we went through his papers, and Shazia and Bashir have a remarkable relationship because they both. Bashir has a tremendous respect and affection for her as his, and the way he tells the story as his, the first student of true talent who took him seriously as an image painter, and so. And he wants to claim her both, as his great student, but also as a daughter, and that's very much there. And they both, and I say this with great affection for Shazia, also share a certain kind of crankiness. So it's kind of delicious to watch. So you sit down on the floor, and we're all having a great old time. One of the things we thought we'd also do is take Dennis Condon, the teacher of painting who admitted Shazia to RISD. Because part of what we wanted to do was to make sure that it was a properly three-way conversation. It wasn't just about RISD claiming, since RISD is actually funding the project. RISD claiming has one of their great students, which of course they're happy to do, but also to have some kind of, relatively, a somewhat more egalitarian conversation between the various coordinates of what produces this kind of work and talent. And Dennis, who's a lovely, lovely man, agreed to go to Lahore with us. So he sat there on the floor.
Sadia, can maybe bring Shazia a little bit into this conversation and actually see some of the things that you all sort of talked about with Bashir and why that is so important in terms of relocating her practice within that department, but also how it went out from there and sort of changed things for the way that department was looking at miniature painting.
Well, sure. I think part of what's very important is because it is RISD. Yeah. But it's also that the fact that the Americans were willing to go there is important. But yes, what Bashir did, and this is why he was so invested in Shazia's work, is that Shazia was the first student who wanted to subordinate herself to the rigors of miniature painting. So what Bashir did, in fact, was, and this was fairly contested at the time in the National College of Arts, was that he wanted to teach. He developed a curriculum, and he has all of the papers. So he developed the papers, and he developed a syllabus that compressed 18 years of training into 2 or 3. And Shazia decided she wanted to do it. And that's actually what started it. And then there were other students, of course, who took it, and then Shazia painted the scroll, which then launched what we now know as the neo-miniature. So that's actually what happened in Lahore, and now Shazia can take over.
So I've spoken so much. Yeah. Any specific thing?
Yeah, I was actually hoping that you might say a little bit about disruption as Rapture, and also the last post, and how you took that specific miniature formats and then did different things with them.
Yeah. So
and how that arises from your training.
I hope that was evident in the presentation, but it didn't just happen overnight, right? So while I was specializing in miniature painting, so on one side I'm taking I'm putting majority of my time learning the curriculum that Bashir Ahmed has put into play. I also was minoring in painting, so I also had faculty outside of that, and I worked with Salima Hashmi, I worked with Zuhur al-Akhlaq, I worked with other Nazish Ataullah, I worked with other people, because that was the nature of National College of Arts in the late 80s. The fact is that at that time, miniature painting was not popular the way it eventually became. So one had to go in uncharted sort of territory in terms of how to put forth a thesis. And that, for me, was a lot of dedication and a lot of not just the hard work, but to really be able to consolidate the fast thinking that goes as a young student, as an artist, as somebody who's not yet knows how to scale down time to work 18 hours a day at the expense of never making friends because you're working all the time. It suited who I was, my disposition. As you know, few of you know I'm such a hermit. And I worked through that aspect of like the laborious nature. And in that sense also how to learn a language. Before becoming an artist, I was studying at the Connecticut College for Women, and I was studying advanced mathematics and language. So my jump into art was very much about thinking about language and how language and application can occur. So for me, understanding miniature was really about acquiring an understanding of language and then how to learn to speak in that language. I thought I would learn it as a art historian, as somebody who would understand it, theoretically and conceptually, and look at various examples. But the only way at that time was through the time spent with Bashir in proximity to him. And so he was interested in studio art. That's what he did. And so it was also like, okay, well, I then have to actually learn the craft of it. But that wasn't that different from going to an art school, the Rhode Island School of Design, or other schools that are art schools, that the way they are set up. You have to learn a language. You're a visual artist. So in that respect, when I sort of zoom out of that time, I think the desire that this level of confinement is, in a strange way, allowing one to then break outside of the boundaries. And once you get a taste for that, this ability to like live in confinement and then use it to propel yourself and your mind and your heart and your ideas forward, then you understand that that rapport is something that we all exist in. Whether we're dealing as authors or writers or individuals, how we live in this sort of in-between time, in-between spaces constantly. And I think that for me has been the core of where I generate ideas and where my work takes me. And I often try to step outside of places of comfort. So collaboration was never about, oh, I've made this film, let me find a composer who's gonna put the frame on it, right? And it was more like, okay, I have to find those relationships intuitively, I have to build on them. And so the people that work with me have worked with me for years. And it's where their names and their work exists inside my work. I'm not interested in just like paying for somebody to do their service and not sharing the process. So in that kind of collaborative way, I often thought of miniature painting in that objective manner. I was like, okay, this is something that is non-nostalgic because I have to learn about it, whether I have to learn about its history or its materiality and language. It's a very large geographical, political space. It's not just within the nature of a nationalistic language. And I think that's where, in terms of our conversations, have been so exciting, because Sadia wrote a book on the predicament of the post-colonial Islam, and I think that fed my mind. And then she comes up and writes a incredible fiction on a female artist. Of course, it's 1970s, and I feel it plays a lot on Zubaida Agha, but Zubaida Agha is another conference. So in that sense, how we can fluctuate between thinkers and makers and women, and obviously how all of that sort of percolates in our practices is what interests me.
Yeah, and I want to say one thing very quickly, which is that both of us have thanked the students for being here. But I think that's also very important because we're both very invested in education in different ways, right? I've hosted Shazia several times at Rutgers in my series, and she's spent hours with the students. I obviously teach at Rutgers New York, which is the most diverse campus in America, and it's not for the salary, I can tell you. So it's a state school, but it's also a largely working class immigrant campus with a very large Black and Latinx population. And Shazia just thrives when she comes and the students adore her. Why is that important? I think because for both of us, and I say this because we are now collaborating and are looking forward to more collaborations in the future, the humanities and humanistic practice are absolutely bound up with our duty and ethical obligation to others. And of course, there isn't, I think, in my view, no greater obligation than to those who are younger than us, especially since we've managed, since Amitav Ghosh was quoted, to so thoroughly screw the planet, and they're going to have to clean up our mess. So I think that, so that collaboration has been very, very productive for both of us. And of course, I was writing a book about a painter before I met Shazia, but then to have a painter actually love the book was, like somebody had just given me a huge box of chocolates.
What's the collaboration that's coming out of this?
She's the
Will you
boss.
share that a little bit?
Tell me. I don't know.
Sure. No, so for me, first of all, the sort of being able to engage with somebody who's an academic is exciting. Then also in terms of how those of us, like ourselves, our generation, that didn't really immigrate to the U.S. My family, everybody, is in Pakistan. I travel back and forth. I'm in and out of the U.S. a lot. But in terms of what it means right now, in terms of who gets to own what, who gets to speak on whose behalf, these are very incredibly politicized, political spaces in terms of who gets to be in or out of a culture, who gets to represent a culture, who gets attacked for all of these various
misdemeanors
of representation.
Right.
So in that sense, I gravitated to Sadia because I was eager to ask these questions. I've never had one assumption, or I think identity is mercurial. It's constantly evolving and growing. And at the same time, one is quite aware of the politics of the perception of being in the US and what that actually means in terms of perception and what it means in terms of the daily lived and experience. So I think that's how I reached out to Sadia, because after I was reading her book, and then it was also somebody who had grown up and left Karachi, or not left Karachi, but from Karachi. Now, growing up in Pakistan, in Lahore, Karachi and Lahore are very different cultures. I did not have that much access to Karachi. So for me, to really understand Karachi was also through a very different means. So then when you think of the local versus the global, that the framework of such conversations that have been very active for many years, but they get pulled and pushed in different ways, so the collaboration is very intellectual, very conceptual, and then, like most of my collaborations, things open up. It's a process of trust and epiphany. I didn't know, Diane at that time. I met her at my composer friend. She just won the Pulitzer 2 years ago. She was up for a Grammy now. She's suddenly, skyrocketing everywhere. But we've already had 10 years of working together before others came in and wanted to work with her. And that's the nature of my sort of collaborative work, so to speak, is that once the foundation has been laid, then you continuously evolve. So Sadia is working on issues of migrants, and she's very interested. She can share more her new books about relationships between India and Greece, and I'm interested in understanding that. So hopefully that's one project that we'll be working on in the next 2 years. But she's editing the book, and that show's going to travel. So those are the more tactile ways of explaining what collaboration is.
Yeah, I mean, we're both very collaborative people, and we're both also, oddly enough, complete hermits. So I can go for weeks without seeing anybody, and since my partner lives in another city, that just means that I talk to him on the phone 3 times, and I'm done for the day with all my human contact, which works just fine, because he's also writing several monumental books at the moment. But I think what collaboration means here is, of course, and Shazia and I have been in very intense conversation for several years now, is it does open up all kinds of spaces in your head, and you don't know where they're going to go, right? So I've learned this not just with her, but with other people that I have worked with, including Faisal, who's not here today, but for whom I have tremendous respect.
Hasn't Faisal also contributed to the... He
is contributing to the volume as well, and has written a beautiful piece for it. I'm happy to say. So things happen in conversation for both of us, and they've already started happening even in some of the work that Shazia is doing visually, but also the conversations that we did for Aleph, but also we're planning to be in my favorite Greek village, which is one of my homes now and has been for 13 years, for the summer. And this is in Lesbos, which is also, as you know, on the front line of the refugee crisis. I have published a little bit on the Greek debt and refugee crisis, but I refuse to only talk about the refugee situation simply because it's become a cottage industry on its own. And because my friends have been volunteers, for me it's an ethical question of voyeurism. I've been very reluctant to. So what I am actually doing is a kind of 150-year sort of span of a kind of a book of cultural criticism and theory connecting Greek and Indian archaeology and the ways in which racialized identities were produced, both in Greece and Turkey and in India and Pakistan, around discourses of archaeology. And as it turns out, and thanks largely to the fact that I then was forced out of my village and came to London, I've been in the National Archives at Kew and the British Library for the past 2 weeks, and it's been just absolutely splendid. So I'll be back for a couple of months if anybody wants to say hello then. And part of what emerges out of that is that, and this is relatively well known in the case of India, the connections have not been made very well, though, is that, for instance, the 1923 population transfer, or the Lausanne Convention, where Muslim and Turk was produced as Muslim and Greek was produced as Christian, which then led to a formalized population exchange. Population exchange was actually cited as a precedent by Ambedkar in 1947 to defend the creation of Pakistan. And so some of those ideas, which I do trace back to colonial archaeology, are taken up both by Greek modernists and by Urdu modernists like Uratullah Heather, about whom I've written and published. And what I want to do is then come up to the present through thinking through this 150-year epistemology, if you will, of the production of the minority and of the production of the management, a kind of the management of populations where you think you can just move people around and try to align them with space. And that's what I'm working on. So Shazia and I have been talking about this quite intensively. And
I'm going to add that it's going to feed into a body of work that I am doing, which is going to be in sculptural form. So, of course, these are projects that are underway.
So I'm going to be bad and end the discussion and open it up for questions because we don't have that much time. In fact, we're sort of on the edge. There are drinks upstairs as well.
I think you should open to the speakers. One
Okay.
is to invite everybody involved.
Yes, so
Yes, to have the drinks and
I would call for a drink, but I would love, but I want to make sure that there are a couple of that there are students who might want to ask questions who would then feel as if they have to line up behind everybody else and jostle for
don't think any
attention.
students
So if
feel
you
like
guys
that
have
here.
questions, ask. We want to hear from the students. I'm assuming that you have anything to say.
Or you can come upstairs and you can ask either one of us.
Up to you.
but we'll do a couple of questions. Yeah.
No, I guess there is one right there.
Hi,
Hello.
thank you so much for sharing. My question is not fully formed yet, but you know the question I had afterwards. I'm very interested in the idea of the way the miniature art form was used as a kind of, was relegated to the realm of folk, post-partition, and then used as a kind of signifier of Pakistan's intrinsic kind of culture, like in that narrative of nation building, how folk art being relegated to the folk and then being used in discourse of nation building included miniature, if that makes sense. So I'd be curious to understand your reading of kind of the emergence of the neo-miniature, as you described it, as a response to nationalism as it exists now, or kind of refutal, but responses to nationalism as it exists now. I don't know if that's...
That's my territory. Was it addressed to her or me?
To both of you.
Well, oh God, okay. I think that what's come to be called the neo-miniature is, in fact, a kind of complex inhabits the terrain of nationalism as well as attempting to reject it. I think the neo-miniature now in Pakistan has become a very complexly nationalist form. Pakistan's, the nation state is driven in certain ways, right? I mean, on the one hand, the neo-miniature contests religious discourses, but that's not actually incompatible with a certain kind of nationalism, right? So, on the one hand, so there's a lot of, let's stick a gun or a turban in the center of the miniature, and suddenly we're doing critique, which sometimes we are, but at the same time, there's a very, my piece in the RISD volume is actually going to be fairly critical of some of this. Pakistani art has gone global in very particular ways at this point, right? And one of the things that's being sold is national authenticity, right?
Is it being sold by the artists, or is it actually just being sold in the way it's packaged elsewhere?
I'm very happy to say, and my apologies to the audience, I'm not really part of the art world. Like, I parachute in. My PhD is in English literature, and I'm a cultural theorist. I have no idea who's selling it. I guess the people who sell are selling it. It's very hard not to let oneself be commodified. I totally understand it. I've written a book about a woman in a very bad marriage, and I chose not to publish it in the West. Not that anyone was lining up, but I wanted Urvashi Butalia, the Indian feminist, to publish it. And I'm very proud to say that at this point, since I have tenure, it's not a big deal, and I have actually fairly decent salary, but I haven't received a penny for it. But the reason that I did that, the next one's about British colonialism, so anybody wants to pay lots of money for it, I'll give it to them right here and sell it in London. But it's about a woman. So I didn't want it to become part of the Muslim oppressed brown woman carnival in the West, right? So these are very complex things. Can I outwit it? Probably not. But Urvashi was about the best I could think of. She's one of India's great left-wing feminists. She liked the book. I was like, thank you, you can have it. And I'll pay you to publish it. I didn't, but I did. But she didn't either, so it's so far. In any case, so what am I saying? What I'm saying, I don't know who's doing the selling. I think it's everyone a little bit. And the way that it's being framed in criticism also is that it's become part of some kind of Muslim authenticity, and of which the Pakistani state is somehow the guardian, and God help us all. So, I do think that it's become an emblem of a certain kind of nationalism, even while it claims the space of critique. And that's the paradox right now.
Yeah, so...
Yeah. So, anyway, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Anything else? Yeah.
My question is to Shazia. I'm fascinated by your work, and that's why I'm here tonight. But I would like to ask you to perhaps give some guidance in the interpretation of your pieces, because every image seems to have so much narrative and figures going on inside them, and it provokes a very strong response because it's aesthetically beautiful, but I would like to be able to interpret your themes a little bit better. So perhaps like on the example of the image right behind you, or
Yeah, that's, I could talk about one or two works for the entire 30 minutes here. And that's, that as I said, like it's hard to compress in a talk 30 years of work, but not just that. Even when I create a painting, I do a lot of research. I haven't had a path where I've made one work and then just made copies of it. Mm-hmm. Every work of mine represents enormous research, culling of information, ideas that get bumped around and shared with other authors, writers, inspiration. It's all about how can I funnel all of that into something that first fundamentally speaks visually, and then allows you to enter that painting or that work and be able to continuously visit it, so that you don't, even if you've taken enough, then you can re-enter it 20 years later and still find relevance. Still, that's what I question as an artist every day. Why it's so subjective? Like, why am I making what I'm making as an artist? How will my work test itself to me first over a period of time? So how can, that's what allows me to think and make art. And often it is born from either reading, either it's a poem or an essay or a book.
Or a previous, like a miniature which you take from,
yes, of course. And then perusing all the miniatures is like is amazing amount of stimulus. So I can look at one painting, old miniature painting, again and again. Mm-hmm. I have had certain books with me for 20, 30 years, and I can revisit them, and I can still find new ways of entering that space. So that makes it equally hard for me to talk about my work. And that's been the most frustrating thing as an artist, because my work was so complex that people often then just wrote in terms of identity, often in terms of like leaving one culture for another, or what do you call it, the diaspora. Yeah. So it took me a while to even understand, like, I've only been in a certain place for like 3-4 years. Suddenly I'm a diasporic artist. So suddenly I was like framed. So it's often been about frameworks that have become in vogue or exist, and they get pushed a lot more. And I think it's also, as one grows older, then you realize that you do have more autonomy, and trends go up and down, and then once you kind of come out of that, you just make work. So that's one. And of course there is, that's perhaps one of the reasons why I started gravitating towards authors, was that those that had similar histories and similar things that propelled their writing might be able to shed light on the work in ways that that I felt the work wasn't being written about. Or, as I tell my students, it's like you have to step outside of that hermit zone and learn to read and write yourself and articulate. So that also was a learning curve for me. So all of these things, you're right. But if we were having a studio visit, or if we were, in another context, like I can explain to you what each work, what's the story there. It's not unknown to me. It's just impossible to...
Can I add to this for a minute? I think you like this in some ways, right? I have just finished this essay for the book, and I have lived in Shazia's studio and home on and off for the past 3 years. And it's been an extraordinary experience because I look at these things and we talk, and each time that I notice something, she says yes, yes, or no, or whatever. But we've had very intense conversations and arguments as well, because we're both very, very strong and stubborn personalities as well. So we bicker, and that's important too, right? Because we want to think together. Why does that matter? Because if you're asking for an interpretation, you're going to have to put forward one too, right? But then with Shazia, one of the things, and again, you take this as you will, there's such an extraordinary, you saw the list of authors she gave you. You start digging for the list of influences or the people she was looking at, right? And there's one story after another, right? It's David Hockney and the Scroll. Who knew? But go back and look at it. Or it's, Safavid painting, but then suddenly she's quoting Ibn Arabi, right? At the same time, and this is absolutely my favorite story, which was that I got really interested in one of my favorite paintings, probably the favorite, is Red Riding Hood, right? With those dots all over it, and it's from the 90s. It's an extraordinary feminist painting. It's very beautiful, and it's completely eerie and terrifying. It's the 90s. Angela Carter is writing things like The Bloody Chamber. Shazia and I are both at college. It transforms my generation's feminist imagination. But then suddenly she starts talking. I said, explain the dots. I'm not getting the dots. Talk to me about the dots, or tell me something about the dots. And there are these beautiful dots all over, right? And then the story that comes is this, right? And then we can end here and get home. But it's that that there are. First, she says, I got interested in this idea that, I'm sorry, I'm speaking back to you in the third person, but I got interested in this idea that, a Western painter, a white painter, because we're all Westerners. I'm a Westerner. I've lived there for 30 years, but nobody thinks of me as Western, and whatever I do. Can paint one dot and get paid millions. Right, and here I'm like laboring away, and it's not, but then suddenly the craft is important, and I'm only seen as that. So that comes, and then so she says, so I started like painting these dots and then letting them fall wherever they were, because I was like, it was a kind of performance of the erasure of my labor, right? And I said I wouldn't rub out the dot that I painted. So that's the first thing she says. So I'm like, oh, great. I have to go and write it up. And then I write, and then I read it to her on the phone, right? I'm like, come on, I need some help here. And it's not, I don't normally take permission from people, right? But it's also that I need somebody to deal, meanwhile, my partner is completing his 900-page book manuscript for Duke, so he's not available, so I have to talk to someone. And then what happens is that then she says, you know what? And then I was also I was in America and all of that, and then she goes, it's also bullet holes. I'm like, huh? What? She says, I was really fascinated by the Southern gun culture, because, she spent time in Houston, right? And so she goes, and there's an American obsession with guns. So she then pulls out this poster, right? Because being Shazia, she drives across America in this car from RISD to Houston when she gets the residency, and then decides that she is spending all her time in the Third Ward, which has everything to do with zoning and race in America and so on. And she's one of the first South Asian artists to actually seriously engage with the African American experience. But then it turns out that she actually went to a gun range. And so she still has the poster, which I'm thinking of producing, with the holes in it. And so those dots on the painting are evoking all kinds of things, the erasure of labor, the defacement of beauty, and the sense that beauty itself is a defacement for women sometimes and is weaponized, and then also the violence of the culture into which she's migrated, right? And it's all there in these dots.
So
Interpretation.
that's an amazing point at which to end and have a drink.